True story, when I got back into trials, I knew that Inspired made the best street trials bikes, but I didn't know what any of the names of their bikes meant. Since I have their top 3 bikes right here in the shred spot, I wanted to do a full breakdown so you can decide which one of these bikes might be right for you. Just a quick disclaimer, each one of these bikes has been slightly modified by me, but we'll get to that later. Also, I paid full price for these first 2 bikes, and the third one is a test bike that we're borrowing from Trials Superstore. I think the best place to start is why is Inspired the gold standard of street trials bikes? And it would be easy to say, oh, the geometry of the bikes is good, the components of the bikes are good, both of which are true statements, but what's more important is that Inspired has had direct access to the best street trials riders on the planet for the last decade. They've taken input from riders like Danny MacAskill and Clarkson and tons of other riders who have helped Inspired make these bikes the best they can possibly be. Behind me, I have the Inspired Arcade, the Inspired Fourplay, the Inspired Hex. These are the 3 flagship models from Inspired, and the best way to think about them is on this street trials spectrum. So over here, we've got the Inspired Arcade, which is the most street of the street trials bikes. Over here, we have the Inspired Hex, which is the most trials of the street trials bikes. Any one of these bikes can get the job done for you, it's just the geometry suits each end of the spectrum better. The main difference between these bikes other than geometry is the wheel size. So the Inspired Hex has a 26-inch wheel, whereas the Fourplay and the Arcade have a 24-inch wheel. Inspired also just came out with a bike this year called the Link, which has a 22-inch wheel. Now the smaller wheels are going to perform a little bit better on street when it comes to spinning. So if you like doing 360s, 180s, you come from more of a BMX kind of background where you're used to a smaller wheel on street, that's where the wheels really shine. The reason why I love the Hex as much as I do is that I grew up riding trials on a 26-inch bike, and this feels the closest to that. The bigger wheels roll smoother, and the geometry is super versatile. I've actually even competed on this bike. Before I dive into each one of these bikes and fully break it down, there's one other naming convention that Inspired has that we should talk about, and that's how they do the different models of the bikes. So you'll notice there's a team model and a pro model of each Inspired bike. The frames are exactly the same. There's no difference in the frame itself. It's only the component spec. So the team model is what their team riders use, and that's their highest end spec of the bike. That's the most expensive one. Then you've got the pro level, which is a super good component spec, but it's not as expensive. The main difference that you'll see is in the wheels. So the wheels on the team model would be a free hub, super high engagement hub, and on the pro model you'd have a free wheel in the back, which is still totally fine, just not as good. There are also a few little changes in the handlebars they send and the brakes, but really it kind of comes down to the wheels. And again, both spec are very, very good. It's just one is slightly better than the other. That's the difference. Let's have a closer look at the Inspired Hex. This is a 26-inch street trials bike with an aluminum frame. This is also the team spec, so it has a free hub in the back instead of the free wheel. This particular wheel is a Hope Pro 4 Trials hub, definitely capable of getting the job done. I have made just a few changes to the bike, however. I swapped out the tires for these Maxxis Icon. They're 2.2 tires, so the same width that came on the bike, but they have a little bit thicker sidewall, which is what I was looking for with these tires. I've also used different brakes on this bike. It came with Magura MT7s, which are great brakes, but the Hayes Dominion are incredible. I'd highly recommend checking those out if you haven't already. The last change I made on this bike was the handlebar. I run Deity high side bars on pretty much all of my bikes, and it's the same rise and width as the Inspired Team bar, but I just prefer these bars a little bit more than the Inspired ones, so I always kind of swap them out. And they come in all kinds of different colors, so I try to match the color of the bar to the bike. All of the changes that I made to this bike don't really make that much of a difference overall with the bike. It still rides pretty much the same way it did when it came out of the box. Some of these tweaks were just more personal preference and testing new things out just to see how they'd work. So this bike right out of the box could get the job done for you. It's just nice to kind of personalize each bike that you get, and that's exactly what I did here. Next up, we have the Inspired Fourplay. This is a 24-inch wheeled aluminum street trials bike, and this bike is actually the first new street trials bike that I bought a few years ago. You might remember me saying that I didn't know the difference between the different names of the bikes, and so this was the first bike that I bought because I thought this one was the top one. I didn't know that each name meant something for wheel size and geometry and different elements. So this is the Pro model, meaning that the spec is slightly different, and in this case, it has a free wheel on the back instead of that free hub. But you can see that the spec otherwise isn't that dramatically different. I also made a few slight changes to this bike. I put a pair of Shimano DX pedals on here, and just like every other bike, I put a set of Deity high side bars and some Deity lock-on grips here as well. But other than that, this bike is pretty much stock. What came out of the box is what I'm still riding today. This is the Inspired Arcade. It's a 24-inch street trials bike, but this frame is made out of steel. So of the 3 bikes, which are all great all-around bikes, this is the most street of the bikes. The steel frame, the steel cranks, the steel fork, it definitely looks like a BMX bike, but I can assure you, you can ride trials on this bike because I've done it myself. The bike you're looking at here has the Pro spec, so it has the freewheel in the back. But one thing you might notice is that the component choice on this bike is different from the components that are on the Pro spec for the Fourplay. And that's because this bike is purpose built for street. So things like the steel fork here and these steel cranks are gonna be different than what you got on some of the other Pro specs. That's an important thing to note as well. I made just a minor change to this bike. Of course, I put the Deity high side bars on, and Deity had some orange lock-on grips, so I had to. Truthfully, any of these 3 bikes would be incredible to start learning street trials on. There's a reason why some of the best riders on the planet use Inspired bikes, but being the gold standard doesn't necessarily mean that they're cheap. So Inspired makes another model called the Inspired Flow, which is a more affordable 24-inch street trials bike. If these bikes here are a little out of your price range, you might want to check that one out. Hopefully this video provided a little bit more clarity into the way that Inspired names their bikes. But there's so much detail that goes into each one. The best thing to do is to check out this playlist of unboxings here. Each time we put one of these bikes together, we go through the background of the bike and all the pieces that go into it, and it's really helpful to see what each bike is all about. Now, if you just got one of these bikes and you want to learn how to ride it, this playlist right here is going to help you get started.